I had a great conversation today with Eric Cressey. He is the co-founder of Cressey Sports Performance, a strength and conditioning facility, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. Works with baseball pitchers, but also all athletes. And he's also been with the Yankees as their director of player health and performance. Eric and I talked about a lot of things, sort of how he realized there was this niche in baseball pitchers to focus on their movement, to focus on integration, all the way to some lessons he's learned from being the coach of his daughter's 8U softball team and some of the differences that athletes should think about as far as training like the professionals train, focusing more on sort of age appropriateness and what that means for volume as far as strength and conditioning or what you're doing in the weight room versus the skill work. So I learned a lot. I think you will too. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Bet On Me podcast, the ultimate resource for softball players looking to take control of their training and reach their full potential. I'm your host, Krista Stoker, and on this show, we'll be discussing everything from taking a holistic approach to your training to data-driven strategies for maximizing and growing yourself, not only on the field, but off. At S2 Breakthrough, we believe that athletes should lead their own journey and push past any perceived ceilings on their talent. So join us as we explore the world of softball player development and help you bet on yourself. Because when you bet on yourself, you can't lose. All right, back for another episode and super excited because I feel like our guest today has been inspiration to us a lot at S2. And so I'm excited to pick his brain today. We have Eric Cressey, who's co-founder, Cressey Sports Performance, and also the current director of player health and performance for the Yankees. So thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me, Krista.
Yeah. So I think this kind of, instead of maybe getting into like the full backstory, which I'm sure as mine feels these days is long and feels like it's been almost a lifetime at this point, but maybe just get into the initial, like you have this kind of this, or you at least started as a niche for baseball pitchers, and what sort of made you realize there might be something there, or how were they being underserved at the time that you felt like you guys could serve?
Yeah, for sure. To be honest, a lot of it was rooted in my own experience as an athlete. I was actually a tennis player, had a bunch of shoulder issues, kind of starting my sophomore, junior year of high school, and got recruited to play in college. And by the time I was a senior in high school, my shoulder was kind of shot, and I kind of went more in the direction of soccer, which was my other sport, largely because my shoulder was not in great shape. And, I struggled with it. I actually, for other reasons, wound up not playing college soccer, but just over the course of those years, the shoulder got worse and worse. I worked at a tennis club for, summers for 8 years and strung rackets and gave lessons and did all that stuff. And, what was interesting is after I graduated from undergraduate, the summer, it was actually the summer of 2003 when I was 22, my shoulder was as bad as it had been. It wasn't just, pain with playing tennis. It was, keeping me up at night. It was really, really significant. And what was wild to me was I had gone through, multiple courses of physical therapy and it hadn't really gotten better. So we actually scheduled the surgery for the first day of my winter break. So I was going to take all my final exams during my first semester of grad school and then race home and have surgery and, be in a sling for, 4 weeks before I went back for the next semester. And I got to school and, I said, you know what, I'm studying this. Like I know a fair amount about anatomy and, I love to train and, I'm just going to experiment. I'm going to try to figure this out on my own and, really overhaul my training. And I was fortunate. I found a good, kind of manual therapist right down the street from the University of Connecticut who, was able to dig around in my armpit and help me out. And it was pretty cool. I called my surgeon's office on Halloween of my first semester of grad school. And I said, hey, I don't need this surgery. I feel good. It was very eye-opening for me at the time. Just like, hey, how did I figure this out as like a, novice 22-year-old that didn't really have like the schooling that all these physical therapists had. And what I realized that I was a big part of the problem. Like I hadn't modified my training. I hadn't made weight room adjustments. I hadn't been aware of like all the different resources that were out there, So I look back on my physical therapy experience and I was one of 4 or 5 patients at a time. I got the ready to print rotator cuff program. Nobody really paid attention to the technique. Didn't have any manual therapy. I didn't have any counseling on the exercise outside of that. Like I was still trying to like play tennis, work through it. So, beyond just the physical aspect of it, optimizing movement, there was also kind of a lack of an awareness of kind of like just this, acute chronic workload is, I would just go back to banging my head against the wall after I took a Tylenol for my headache. And so it allowed me to really kind of think of things a little bit differently, so that when I did go to the private sector, with this shoulder history of my own, and some of these baseball players found me, I think what it really caused me to do is think really, really hard about integration and how can we create synergy across all the different offerings. And that's grown by leaps and bounds to the point that now our facility, obviously we serve players from all 30 major league organizations, and the Yankees role, and obviously we see high school and college guys and all that stuff. But we've built this offering out where there's hitting, there's pitching, there's manual therapists, there's physical therapists, there's our strength and conditioning coaches, there's nutrition experts, largely just because we found that it was necessary to have it all under one roof. And that was largely born out of the fact that I just saw two really challenging extremes in the baseball community. I saw that, hey, here's, squat, bench, clean, just do the football program, and, then go play your sport and things will magically work out. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we saw kind of like the foo-foo, rotator cuff programs that I had been given, honestly, as an injured athlete back in the day. And, I remember, distinctly a local high school coach in Massachusetts saying, you'll never need more than a 15-pound dumbbell to train. And, we just really realized that there was a important middle of the road that, that recognized that athletes had unique demands in these sports, and that, we could push them incredibly hard as long as we were cognizant of some of the structural adaptations, some of the functional adaptations, and, really the demands of the sport. So, out of that, and, we kind of, for lack of a better term, we kind of created a little bit of an industry of baseball specific strength and conditioning. And then, obviously there's been a lot more facilities in that vein that have really taken off, probably in the year since 2007.
Yeah. That's awesome. I'm listening to you and thinking, as to, it almost feels like we're starting at the very beginning of everything you're saying. So I wish maybe that softball had learned a little bit more from the path that you've sort of paved. The thing I wrote down was like the football program versus the band, the banded exercises at PT. One of the things that we run into for our softball pitchers in particular, although it applies to everyone, is that the return to throwing program, when people are injured, they sort of, have some sort of injury. They do very, very light something, band work, whatever it is. And they get handed a return to throwing program, and they're like, you're released, here, go do this. They haven't lifted, they haven't done anything to build up. And then the worst part for softball is that the return to throwing program is an overhand throwing program. It's just based on the quantity of throws. And so that's something that we're still trying to, in many ways, that sounds like you guys have really paved the way, have conversations of, it's not PT and then full go, that there's this like bridge.
Yeah, there's return to play versus return to performance, and those are very different things. And I think that's the higher standard. I was actually just chatting with a friend recently, and he said, do you think it's when I'm looking for a physical therapist, should I find someone that works with athletes? And I say, you're better off. And the reason is very simple: is the qualifying criteria for success is higher. If you're a major league baseball pitcher that throws 95 to 97 miles per hour, it's not good enough for them just to get you asymptomatic so that you can, grab a glass off the shelf without your shoulder hurting. Like, you have to get back to the big leagues and be able to throw at that level, throw back-to-back days out of a bullpen. So I do think there's something to be said about, not just being asymptomatic, but actually, building a robust foundation of work capacity and quality movements and a very sport specific progression of stress.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had written down maybe some of what you saw were some of the biggest benefits. Obviously, we got a little bit to this as sort of either return from injury or injury prevention, but what are some of the biggest benefits, changes, you could tell a story, whatever is easiest for this, that you've seen from the guys as they've sort of dedicated to, I'm going to say movement quality, but integration or this sort of approach to training?
Yeah. Actually, I'll give you a great example, just because I'm really proud of him. He's having a great year. Johan Oviedo is a Cuban-born player of ours who's basically major league with the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he's having a career year. I'll send him this podcast after it goes live. But Ovi is a weight room savage. Maybe not the best example for obviously a collection of youth softball, parents and coaches and players, but this is a guy who likes lifting some big boy weights, really, really big dude. And, it was an interesting one where I think over the course of his career, he was using a lot of bullets in the weight room. Like he was actually, those guys that had to leave the gym exhausted. And, you kind of get to a point where, hey, a baseball weighs 5 ounces. You don't need to squat 800 to throw it harder. And in fact, it slows you down. And this off season, we actually, we had some really good conversations with him about, hey, listen, like, we got to pull back a little bit in the weight room, focus on moving the weights faster. Let's be athletic. Let's get back to some of those, those foundational principles of mobility and, just putting yourself in the best position possible to apply force and all that. And, cool thing about it is, we're having this conversation on May 22nd. So he's, effectively 6-7 weeks into his season and highest average fastball velocity of his career, which is cool because he's playing in Pittsburgh. And generally speaking, guys don't throw hard in Pittsburgh in the month of April when it's a little bit chilly. So just cool to see, like it took a big leap of faith for him to buy into that and kind of change, some of his weight room mentalities. He wasn't all in at first. Like it took some convincing and he had to see some velocity in his bullpens and things like that. But, it's the kind of thing that's going to, I think make him a lot more sustainable over the long term. And, you want to use your bullets in the right place. And certainly that's a very different discussion from what we might have with a 14-year-old softball player who's never really lifted weights and is really hypermobile and all that. But it just speaks to this idea of you have to have hard conversations with your coaches about what your window of adaptation is. Where are the biggest places where you can have success really easily. And I think what we see with I'm sure a lot of the athletes that you're interacting with is, they think that taking an extra 500 swings in the cages or going out and throwing, 800 more balls off the mound every single, week is the solution. In reality, maybe they can do that and get, 0.05% better. Right. In reality, dedicating themselves to the weight room and to learning how to sprint correctly and absorb force and produce it and all these different things, like they might be able to get 50% better in a matter of 3 months with that. Yep. But the kicker is it's not just going to be a quality in of itself. It's going to be a quality that facilitates all that other stuff. It's going to make their sport specific practice better. So you have to really, max out the reserve, as best you can. I often allude to it. Mike Boyle had a great comment when he was talking, about youth training. Mike's daughter, won a national championship in hockey. She kind of grew up around U.S. Olympic, hockey players, and his son is a real good lacrosse player. So, and obviously he's trained more kids than he can count over the years. And he said he had a rule for his kids or a goal for his kids of 2 lifts per week from age 11 on. And it's always stuck with me, particularly because my daughters are 8 and they like to hang out in the gym and pull each other around on the sleds and, swing on the TRX and stuff. But you think about it, at age 11, it's really foundational. It's learning how to move. And, maybe it's 1 or 2 weeks coming in and having fun. And then, maybe when they're 16, 17, 18, it might be 4 lifts a week when, they're off season, and then in season, maybe it's 1 or 2. But just you look for that kind of average of 2 over the course of those 7 years. You go and you do the math on, that's 104 lifts a year, basically, 700 to 800 lifts over the course of, that 7-year period. That's a difference maker. If you just consistently show up. And what we see too often in that age group, and I'm sure you see it as well, is like they're all in for 2 months and then they disappear on you and they come back in and maybe they're all in for a month. And in Florida, where I am now is the absolute worst. Just because kids they basically get like a month from Thanksgiving to Christmas. And that's about it. The rest of the time they're being forced to play. Whereas in Massachusetts, like you really can't play that much in the wintertime. You set the ball down when it's too cold to play fall ball, and right. You don't get going until the 3rd Monday in March when you're at practice and you're shoveling off the fields with all the snow. So just a different developmental model for sure in 2 different places.
Yeah. This kind of jumps ahead to like the differences in maybe things that you would do or not do with some of your higher level athletes, your professional athletes versus this teenage years. Because I think one of the things we see a lot is it will be something just very, very niche and specific and like this very particular movement. And our parents will be like, what do you think about this? And it's like, well, your daughter's 15 and she needs to learn how to hinge. So before we get into like, tapping into this, very niche thing, first we have really high level college athletes who have very specific things that we might be targeting or things like that. So what are some things, maybe just blanket generalities of things, different approaches that you would take between professional, off season pitcher, teenage athlete, just trying to train?
Yeah. I think the first thing I would say is just remember, you don't want to do the program that the pro athlete does. You might want the program that the pro athlete had when they were, that age. And what I'll tell you that's so important is I can't emphasize enough how many guys that we have in the big leagues that were late bloomers. That in fact weren't even like the best player in their high school. Like they came into their own late, they didn't get a ton of Division I scholarship offers. Like they kind of sorted out a later date. And to be honest, it's kind of a blessing for a lot of them because, they didn't get overused as that star pitcher when they were 16. But, it's always fascinating to me. Like area codes is like the top 220, 240 high school players in the country. And, I look around our gym at all these big leaguers and, 5-10% of them actually went to area codes. They weren't even in like the upper echelon of talent necessarily at their, their geographic region. So I always come back to like, what were they doing? They were playing multiple sports. They were getting exposed to a wide variety of stimuli. In many cases they were going through growth spurts and dealing with kind of like that awkward 6 inches in 6 months surge that, kind of makes them look like a newborn horse. And, like I work with Riley Opelka, who's a top 20 tennis player, 6'11". He's like, if you could have seen me at ages 12 and 13, like I could barely walk. And now he's one of the springiest, most reactive guys. He's a top 3 server of all time. Like there are so many late bloomers that kind of figure it out down the road. So, I always just tell people, just remember, we're slow cooking these athletes. We're having them fall in love with athletic participation. We're exposing them to a wide variety of activities, giving them this really rich proprioceptive foundation. And we're layering skills that ultimately, when the time is right, are going to set them up for success. So, that's the biggest thing I would say is like, just because you see a pro athlete doing it doesn't mean that it's right for a young athlete who may need very, very foundational stuff. Yeah. And the thing that I often tell folks, and Greg Rose at the Titleist Performance Institute, I think has done a great job of emphasizing this, is sometimes those adolescent growth spurts, they're the best times to really train power, to be athletic. And to be honest, what's kind of a bummer about softball and baseball? They're not really that powerful. There's a lot of standing around. Yeah. And that's honestly why we lose folks in this game sometimes is, they go to lacrosse or they go to another sport and it's just action packed and it's always moving. But if you play a soccer game, right, I think the average midfielder in a soccer game covers about 7 miles with 2,200 changes of direction. And that's not just jogging, like that's sprint, walk for 90 minutes. And then on top of that, you play basketball, you get all those different stimuli. We can't give kids that reactive stimulus on a baseball or softball field. It's physically impossible with the way that the game is structured, the way that practices are structured, game scenarios, things like that. So it's so important to get exposure to other sports, play pickup hoops, do whatever it is you possibly can, because that stimulus is a really, really important foundation. Yeah. Sorry, that was a tangent.
No, it's a good one. We have a lot of data on our athletes who are early bloomers and their injury rates are just through the roof. And a lot of times, those are the people we find that we just have to keep delivering this message of like, it's not a sprint here. It's amazing that you're this good, this young, but you have so much time. So like on top of these, explosiveness you have and how big you are, like that's all awesome, but we got to slow it down. And sometimes they just want to keep fueling it. And we'll be like, it's on top of really bad patterns. So like you need to just slow it down, and sort of the ratios that you were talking about earlier, I think become so important, which is like, it's got to be higher ratio of just getting movement quality because you already can do all of these things. And it's just a conversation that we struggle with a lot in softball pitching in particular, the pitch count and overuse, which maybe soon you will see with your daughters, is like a whole different beast because it's just something that's wildly untouched and not talked about. And so that combination we just find kind of, I think maybe we've talked about a lot. Maybe it's not as, because they're not obvious. They are obvious, but they're not obvious injuries. It's not Tommy John's. It's, stress fractures in the back or hip issues. And so it just doesn't get talked about as much, but definitely see the correlation between late and early bloomers, which is
the interesting about you hinted at our girls, and so I have 28-year-olds and a 4-year-old, so we have 3 daughters in our house, and our 8-year-olds, they could not be more different. Like one is a goofball, left-handed swinging, like just staring around at the fields all around her. Like, you have to keep her locked into the game. She's pasty white like I am. And then her sister is a couple inches shorter. She's right-handed. She's like an absolute rule follower, locked in on everything. She's got my wife's like Lebanese/Italian skin complexion. They're totally different. And so it's actually been a blessing for me because, like Addison learned to swim faster. Lydia is smaller, so she's been great with like gymnastics and dexterity and stuff like that. So I've always been kind of mindful of not comparing my daughters, just because I saw, like, I was there the day they were born. They were different in the womb at ultrasounds. From day one. One was screaming, one was super mellow, one needed the NICU, one didn't. So I've always had that perspective. But I've seen other parents struggle. So what's really fascinating is I was lucky. Our girls, Jupiter, Florida is kind of like a hotbed for baseball players, golfers, all that stuff. So our girls are lucky. We had 2 retired major league pitchers as our coaches, and their daughters both play on the team, and they're some of our kids' best friends. On that team, we had a collection of like girls who had like kind of a variety of different experiences, right? Some, it was their first time ever playing. Our girls were on the team as 7-year-olds last year, so they're playing 8U. So this year they were kind of like the older kids in the league, but this is kind of the first year where they had like, 3 or 4 travel ball girls on their team. And, those are girls that they're just playing a lot more games. They're making a sacrifice to, they have practice, 4 nights a week, and they go to tournaments where they play, 6 games in a weekend in Georgia and all this at age 8. And, but concurrently, our girls are at dance on Wednesdays and Mondays. They've got gymnastics on Tuesdays. They'll come like run around and play at the gym with us. They have like, a crafts club after school one day. Then they got softball practices Tuesday, Thursday nights, and usually games on either Friday or Saturday. They play soccer in the fall. Like, they've done a wide variety of activities. They swim in our pool, all that stuff. And I remember distinctly talking to one of the other coaches on my team, and I was like, do you think any of those travel ball girls can actually do a cartwheel right now? And it's not like a disparaging thing. It's just that they've sold out for one skill. And they're frankly, they're very far ahead of our kids. Yep. And I work in Major League Baseball. Like, I'm around baseball all the time. I'm not at all worried. Like, our girls are going to be great, just because I know that they're putting themselves in a position to pick things up later on. And what I love is they're curious. Yep. I'd rather have kids that are curious to try a lot of different things than kids that are, burned out on one thing by the time they're 11 or 12. And it's not a criticism of, the parents that are doing travel ball. And certainly, like, if those kids are excited and loving it, like that's awesome too, as long as there's obviously, limitations on, potential for overuse and stuff like that. But I think as long as kids are happy, they're active, they're participating, that's the most important thing.
Yeah. I had a really similar situation. I was saying to you, my oldest son is 7, so he's playing, I'm not sure what you call it. I guess it's baseball. 7-year-old baseball. And we played a team that appeared to similarly have a lot of travel ball kids, whatever that means at 7. And they just, mashed the ball. They knew how to make force outs at different bags. They were like tagging our kids. And our sidelines were, panicking. One of the dads came up to me and was like, basically, like, what'd you think about that? I'm like, nothing. There's a difference. Yeah. Like, baseball and softball they're very complicated sports. So the more you're exposed to them, the more that you sort of get the sport. But I was like, it doesn't actually mean anything. But it's a hard conversation for parents, because it's, if your kid isn't in it at all, obviously they'll be behind the other kids. But if you keep them curious, like you're saying, they're interested, they're trying it, like, nothing means anything until puberty at the earliest. So
I agree. And even if it wasn't like that, the point is that you want your kid to love what they love, not what you love. That's something I have to constantly recognize. And, like, my daughters love, reading me the lineup for the Yankees game every night. And they're actually watch games now where they'll ask about situations, now that they've played the game. So to me, that's exciting, is that, we've fostered a great relationship, for them with the game, and something we can do together, similar to what I did with my, grandfather when he took me to games when I was little. So I think that's an important part of it. And I worry when we push, kids too hard, too young. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for, challenging kids appropriately, really at all ages of development, to be better versions of themselves. But, it's got to be their idea. That's the most important thing.
Yeah. Not to change topics from younger kids to the Yankees, because that seems like a little bit of a change here. But Maybe if you could just high level sort of talk about the goals of your role with
Sure.
the Yankees, maybe sort of why I think they created that role for you, or
Yeah.
why they created that role and sort of some of the purposes of it. Because I
Sure.
think it kind of touches and pulls everything we've talked about together.
Yeah. So, to give you a little idea, as you mentioned, my role is player health and performance. I'm the director of the department. That department encompasses strength and conditioning. It includes nutrition and to some degree, kind of manual therapy / massage therapy where appropriate. We have several strength coaches as well as like a coordinator of manual therapy underneath our department, who will all do soft tissue work on our players. So both of our major league strength coaches, our AAA and our AA strength coaches, are all licensed massage therapists too. So it's kind of something that came together, but it runs in parallel to sports medicine, which, as you can imagine, is like kind of traditional physical therapists, athletic trainers, as well as our team doctors are technically under sports medicine as well. And then we have a performance science department, which really does a ton of things. It's our biomechanics lab, it's our force plates, it's our sleep schedules when we're traveling. It is some of our our GPS data. They scrutinize Hawkeye data for workload and a lot of those different things. So we kind of joke we're a little bit of a three-headed monster. There's department directors for both of those as well. And the three of us, kind of work really, really in tandem to make sure that, the systems are in place that we need to, to not just support our current athletes, but to identify, players for both the amateur draft, as well as for, potential free agent signings, things like that. So we're intimately involved on everything from actually, working with the athletes to, scrutinizing medicals and providing, higher level information for our front offices and, effectively leaving it better than we found it. It's my fourth year with the organization. So, it's been a very big learning experience. I obviously came from self-employment, where you're often like expected to always have the answer or be the last, voice in every decision and things like that. So, I've actually enjoyed being an employee in the sense that, you get to go out of your way to find a way to be the dumbest person in the room more often and really learn. But yeah, I mean, a big part of my role is working to ensure synergy across departments. And so on a daily basis, I talk with hitting coaches, pitching coaches, folks in the sports science realm, folks in the sports medicine realm. I'm super fortunate to have access to, some really, really bright individuals in like the sports med space, not just our own team doctors, but also, we have players that are going for second opinions and things like that. So it's a pretty exciting time, and I'm fortunate to work with some awesome people and a really supportive front office and ownership group.
Yeah, that's awesome. Is there maybe one or two things that you feel like really proud of that have changed in the time period that you've been there, or that you've been able to implement in the system that have had a big impact?
Yeah, for sure. I think I won't dig into really, really, really crazy specifics on it. I can tell you our amateur draft evaluation process is as buttoned up as there is in the game today. I think our scouts do an amazing job, and myself and a few other folks that are kind of on the medical side, sports medicine side, that are really to be involved on that side of things. I think for a long time, baseball viewed scouting and player development as very separate things. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've really worked hard to do is really kind of extend an olive branch to amateur scouting, just because the scouts identify players that we can develop, and we need to be part of that conversation because we know what kind of players we can develop. So we have a really, really good idea of exactly what we do well and how to target those players, in the draft and free agency, all that stuff. And that's where you've seen, scenarios, not just where we've, actually our ninth rounder from 2021 is already in AAA. He took a huge step forward. He's doing amazing. He was one of the, the guys that we really loved in the draft, and we got him, later than we would have otherwise expected because other people evaluated him different than us, and it's worked out amazingly for us. So that's been something that I've been really excited about. And not only that, just, the way that, we've been able to do some cool things alongside sports medicine and, the acute care of soft tissue injuries and early mobilization and some of that stuff, I think is, even just everything from ankle sprains to, acute hamstring strains. Some of the stuff that we've done, I think, has been really, really compelling in terms of shortening return to play timelines for athletes and, reducing the likelihood of re-injury. So I'm real proud of those two things right off the top of my head, in particular, because they involve multiple departments all working together to kind of take this thing to higher ground.
Yeah, That's awesome. All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up there because I'm sure we can talk forever. But maybe if you could just tell the listeners where they can find you if they want to follow along or learn more about what you do.
Yeah, sure. My personal website is ericcressey.com, and it's just Eric Cressey on both Twitter and Instagram. Our facility is Cressey Sports Performance. And then the one that probably might interest your listeners the most is the podcast. It's the Elite Baseball Development Podcast, but it is far from baseball only. We interview a lot of, folks on the periphery of the game, whether it's, mental skills coaches, hitting coaches, strength and conditioning experts, you name it. So it's not just a bunch of baseball guys talking about baseball. There's something for the softball players as well.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate it. And like I said, you've definitely inspired us for sure. And we'll be following along as well.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Bet On Me podcast. If you can, go to where you're listening to this, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, like it, give us a review. And if there's anything in particular you want to hear us talk about or a guest that you want us to have on, just let us know. Go to our social media, send us a direct message, or you can email us at info@s2breakthrough.com. We're always looking to talk about what you guys want to talk about. So shout us out, let us know what you want to hear, and give us a review.